Welcome to Hacked in the Dark, a podcast featuring Forge in the Dark games and their designers. My name is Mark Cleveland. I'll be taking over for the podcast for a little while so that Justin can have a break. And my guests today are Dustin and Michael Elliott. We're both working on Synthicide, a previously published game, which is now going to be Forged in the Dark to pick up new fans and followers, I'm assuming. Welcome.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Dustin and my pronouns are he, him.
Hello, I'm Michael. My pronouns are also he, him.
Excellent. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with some of your origin story. I'm really been anxious to hear about what got you into design.
So for me, I come more from the trad side of things. I didn't get into story gaming until I moved to Los Angeles. So most of my high school and college experience was spent with different traditional style games like D20, Modern or D&D or a little bit of Savage Worlds. And to me, making my own content was always way more fun than like reading about other people's content or other than for inspiration for new content. I didn't want to like run other people's content at the table necessarily. And then I also always wanted to make my own mechanics for different situations. And then still in college, while I was still deep in the trad gaming scene, I made a traditional role-playing game called Synthicide, which is what this podcast is about, because we're making a new Hacked in the Dark version that's more narrative-focused. But Synthicide was my first game I've made. I've made some games since then, but Synthicide was a really cool setting, and it used a streamlined tactical combat system with some narrative hooks to make sure that the mission and the character structure and all that stuff was interesting and made sense. So that way you wouldn't have too much Ludo narrative going on. You know how you can have that in some of the trad games. But it leaned more narrative than most trad games do, but it was still very trad because it used tactical grid combat and stuff like that. And that was a big part of my gaming experience because I'm also a huge board gamer, so I love those crunchy mechanics and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
So that was my first RPG designing experience, and it went pretty well. It's a Electrum bestseller on Drive-Thru RPG, which is pretty cool. I'm proud of that. Took a while to get there.
So what I was particularly interested, it seemed like there's a drive for you to step outside of what you were finding. I think a lot of us can share that feeling. A lot of our listeners are also going to be fellow Forge in the Dark designers and game designers of various ilk.
Right.
What about you, Michael? What's your interest here?
Yeah, so I started playing RPGs with like 4th edition D&D. So I kind of got out like later in my life. I wasn't until like in my 20s really when I started playing. And how I got into Blades of the Dark specifically and like game design was I actually started and failed a business. I wanted to produce like a subscription narrative experience where you pay like, $10-15 a month and you get like a piece of a story in the mail that's all like aged, like it's, a page from a 17th century occultist's journal or something. You're piecing together this narrative as it goes month to month. And it was great, but I know how to tell a story, but I don't know how to run a business, turns out. And that's important. So that crashed and died, and I was really burnt out. I think I did the math at some point and realized in order to make it profitable, I had to be working every day for 25 hours a day. So obviously I didn't plan it well. The stuff I was making was too cheap and it took me too long to make. But I've been a writer like my whole life. I love telling stories. And so even though I was really burnt out on creative writing, I still wanted to be making something in my downtime. And it was at that point, about the same point, that I started playing my first Blades of the Dark game, because I'd heard about it through like a couple actual plays on YouTube and Twitch streams. I had been listening to Friends at the Table. They played it for a little while, and I thought, this sounds really interesting. I want to check this out. And almost immediately after my first campaign, I was like, I want to do something with this. Like, this is prime for like a cyberpunk setting or something.
Oh
And
yeah.
that was like early in like the last year of Google Plus existing. So I like reached out to the community and started talking with people through there. And yeah, I've ended up making like a whole bunch of Forge of the Dark games. I'm working on Neon Black, my cyberpunk game. I made Nasty, Brutish, and Long, which is about class war and revolution. I made a Torch in the Dark, which is like a solo dungeon crawling game when you're stealing wealth back from undead nobles. I'm part of the design team for External Containment Bureau, which was on Zine Quest this year. So yeah, I'm hooked. I'm absolutely hooked.
Yeah, you're all in. It sounds like the Blades in the Dark design space is quite wide though too, so you get so much space to move and like explore different genres with it. I'm glad to see you're sticking with the cyberpunk. I remember your work on Neon Black. I was quite impressed with that, and I've also, shown quite a bit of interest myself in that genre, as you may know, my work on runners. So, it's an attractive thing to think about criminals in the future. I suppose that's part of the elevator pitch. Maybe you could talk about that. Either one of you have an idea of what you tell people when they ask you, on the street. They say, "What do you do for a living?" And then you finally get to talking about it. What do you tell them? What sets it apart even from other games like it?
Yeah, it's interesting because it takes that really rich and compelling element of cyberpunk and like criminals for hire using tech and blends it with like a grimdark, hopeless setting and robot focused space opera. So it kind of blows it from a like localized city-based narrative to a galaxy-wide humans versus machines narrative, but you still have that cyberpunk element of small tight-knit crews going on missions. And basically the story is that the galaxy was settled by humans and robots and everyone was happy and living in peace, and then there was a mutant war that almost destroyed everything. And then in the power vacuum of this ruined galaxy, a cult that worships technology and robots took over and rose to power. And now that they place no value on human life, and they only consider killing robots a crime. So now that there's like no human life has any value and there's all these horrible power structures based on violence, people take to the stars and their dilapidated spaceships, and they just kind of drift from one criminal job to the next, trying to make enough money to eat and keep fuel in their ship.
Oh, wow, I love that. This sounds like a good platform for adventures, like a steady stream of adventures.
Yeah, the area where I was inspired for this game was I was playing a lot of D&D and D20 Modern, and I always felt like, you go on these crazy adventures that make no sense. And at the time, Torchbearer wasn't even out yet, so I had never seen that concept of the like, oh, you were the most desperate people in society yet. So that's where I wanted to go with the story for Synthicide when I started working on it years ago. I worked on it for a long time before I ever launched it, but I was just like, I felt like the only people who would become criminals or go on crazy adventures or do these live or die situations for, not enough money would be like people who are just absolutely desperate. So I wanted to create a social scene where everyone is super desperate and there's no like real rule of law. So, everything you do is like you're being paid to hurt someone else, and there's no authority that's going to come after you. You're just hoping the people that you hurt can't take revenge on you for what you do. So it just kind of creates a lot of those like tit for tat dynamics and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm getting some serious like Firefly vibes from this.
Yeah.
Is there another inspiration or two that ties in closely with this that you want to talk about? What do you think your inspirations are, the main touchstones for the game?
So I think the game, when you play it, feels very much like Firefly plus Terminator 2 because of the whole humans versus machines and the inexorable march of technology problem. But my actual original inspiration was the Isaac Asimov Foundation series, which is about a human empire that spans across the galaxy and then falls apart. And then this small enclave of scientists like save everybody. It takes them thousands of years, but they eventually get society back on the right track. And also that society like keeps the tension between humans and robots correct and make sure robots don't become too powerful or whatever. And I was just like, well, wouldn't it be interesting if that like cabal of scientists was evil and thought human life had no value and actually thought robots were better than humans? And then I was just like, oh, and then that would lead to a society where violence is king, and with violence is king, and then you can have a lot of cyberpunk, criminal narratives where you're, gunning your way into a facility to steal, corporate data and stuff like that. And I loved cyberpunk at the time. I hated the mechanics, but loved the setting of Shadowrun, as I'm sure almost everyone listening to this podcast would probably have a similar feeling about the mechanics of Shadowrun. Yeah, so I put the cyberpunk in there because I loved cyberpunk, and then it was honestly just inspired by, like, what if Isaac Asimov's Foundation was like evil tech worshipping robot obsessed people.
Oh yeah, I love that. It's quite compelling too. If you think about it, machines are so efficient, right? Scientists and higher minds alike would probably one day agree that, oh yeah, machines are really where it's at. Machine intelligence, smarter than people, emotionally swayed, but eventually, yes, those people end up being needed. And yeah, maybe they're part of the only solution to our humanity. Does that sound kind of like in the vein of what you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. All right, good. I'm glad I grokked that. So, thinking about your inspirations, I guess this has driven you to really want to have this published. I mean, you said that you've published this work once already, and this is more of like a revision or a revisiting, where you're going to expand the setting to Forged in the Dark type stories, very open to fictional precedents being set on the fly and things like that.
Well, yeah, the reason I picked Blades wasn't just that I felt like my setting was so similar to the Blades setting in terms of the themes and the types of characters that you play, but also Blades is my favorite narrative system because it has such a commitment to the concept of consequence and stakes.
Oh, yes.
Which is something that can be lost when you play a narrative game. So people complain about Ludo narrative where the, traditional game mechanics make something happen that makes no sense. And I feel like narrative games sometimes do, I don't even know what the terminology would be, like pseudo-narrative almost, where it's like it's just a random accruement of scenes based upon whoever had narrative authority at that time and what direction they wanted to go. And you can start to lack cohesion. And the fact that, the fictional positioning system and then all the traumas and the concept of harm and all these things that you have, it takes like some of the concepts of cohesion and consequence that you get in Powered by the Apocalypse games, which I always liked, but then just takes it to the next level with a much higher level of cohesion and consequence, which are just important to me. I think maybe a lot of trad game, I don't know, but as a trad gamer, that was the thing I always loved about traditional games, is like, if you do X, Y might happen. So you have to decide, is it worth doing that? And that you go down this path of accumulating circumstances that cause something to happen. And seeing that in a narrative game, just plain as day, saying like, this is how the system works, and you build toward a reasonable conclusion that might be really bad and you don't want. I really liked that about Blades.
Yeah, the fictional ties are strong between consequences and actions in Blades. It's almost unprecedented. I don't think I've seen it quite this strong, in another game system. So, yeah, I think if you're after that, you picked just exactly the right one. As you're about to crowdfund this game, do you feel like you're on point for your time frame that you have planned? What are we expecting as far as challenges on that? Where are you at?
Well, we have the core mechanics done, and all the setting material from the original game is done. And we have a ton of artwork from the original game as well that we can reuse in this. So really, it's just a matter of, diving deeper on a couple of the mechanics, on terms of how they interact, because we can't wholesale lift absolutely everything from Blades. So we got to do a little bit of refinement, but that's not going to take a whole lot of time because we've already got 40 pages of mechanical content written, and then we have all the story pages already done. So we just got to, flesh out a few more things and throw them together. And we're planning to launch this Kickstarter around the time this podcast drops, actually.
Ooh, okay. So they can go look at it right now if they go where?
If they go to Kickstarter.com and search for Synthicide Sharpers in the Dark.
Perfect. Yeah, they can see the spelling in the title in case you're listening in. Yeah, so that'll be on Kickstarter later this month, which will be around the time this drops. Obviously, print is in the works. Is there some additional content that you're planning as stretch goals? What can we expect once you've hit your goal, which we know you will?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of stretch goals are going to revolve around giving deep faction sheet treatments for all the different factions you can interact with. So, all the different tiers of the different factions and, how they behave and how you interact with them, just to kind of give some of that mechanical teeth to the already existing narrative.
Ooh, juicy. Yeah, that sounds like a great addition for a more of a longer campaign, to dig in much deeper. I think the GMs will appreciate that as well as players. They might be able to mine that for story information and cool stories for their characters and crew ideas. Yeah, let's talk about the touchstones a little bit more. The touchstones that you mentioned before, often these touchstones will impact the mechanics and how the game develops. What kind of challenges have either of you been facing in delivering on your touchstones? Like, how has that impacted the development of the game so far?
Well, I know a big challenge I gave Michael going in is like a really important part of Synthicide is its grim darkness and the way that this bleak society totally emotionally destroys your characters. So I gave a challenge to him to make that narratively come to life using the Forged in the Dark engine. I wanted that aspect to be like a big hook for what drives your characters.
My touchstone for this game is basically Synthicide itself, because Dustin did make a really interesting sci-fi world, and so my job is basically to okay, how do I take as much of that and translate it mechanically into the game so that players are seeing it and it triggers all the different fictional mechanical things we want it to be triggering. Like, for example, there is a thing we want to play with is lethality and death of characters, which is a difficult thing to do in an RPG because it's something that you want it to be scary, but you don't want it to actually happen too often, right? This is a thing that often happens in Blades of the Dark games where the system itself kind of wants you to care more about the crew than the individual characters, right?
Oh, yeah.
The crew is the thing that's supposed to survive, and characters can cycle through. They could die, they could retire, they could go to prison. But something that I've seen come up more and more, as I talk to more people playing this game, playing games myself, people don't really want to relinquish control of their characters. They want to see that character all the way through and then be done. It's not really about the crew. It's about this awful found family of scoundrels and how, they become at cross purposes and eventually either, kill each other or succumb to vice.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They often come at odds with each other too over time. Which
is great because because the game wants that to happen, right?
Yeah, there's always an expression going on between the players about their characters too. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and I guess the characters are expendable in Blades much more so than we would say in Synthicide. From what I've seen so far, it looks like there are some seriously different options to avoid the badness at the end of the bottom of the pit, so to speak.
Yes. The thing is, lethality is there and death is prevalent, but there are ways to kind of tax your character and come back from death that Mark was playing with, because that was a theme in the original game. In the original game, you would die often, but then your character could use a meta currency to resurrect. But if you did not have that meta currency, you could not come back from death. So you were always worrying about the permanent death. And that meta currency was often earned by maintaining the emotional health of your character, which is a huge challenge in the Synthicide universe, is maintaining your emotional health. So you can, very often run out of that meta currency and then end up on the wrong end of a blaster gun and then go down. And then you're like, well, I guess this time it's the real permanent death. And Michael came up with some cool stuff to make that happen in the Forged in the Dark engine.
Well, before you kill my character, let's talk about making one. I'm really pretty excited to think about a character in this game world and in your system, because I had a sneak peek at some of the materials. I noticed something in particular about the nature of your playbooks. Could you tell me more about when you're creating a character and the modular nature of your playbook design?
Right, so one of the big things about character creation in the original Synthicide is when you would first make the character at level 1, because it's a level-based system, and then you would commit to your archetype of what's called a bioclass. And a bioclass basically describes how cybernetic and or how mutated your character is. And you have all these different extremes of like no cybernetics, no mutations, no cybernetics, tons of mutations, a little bit of cybernetics, a little bit of mutations, or tons and tons of cybernetics. Like those are the different archetypes you can commit to when you make your character to kind of get that blended crew of different types of characters. And I was working with Michael, like, well, how do we make this happen in Forged in the Dark? Like, how do you handle cybernetics, and how do you handle mutations, and how do you make them be a commitment that you choose an archetype when you first make your character? And he ran some ideas by his players and did some playing with him, and I was like, what if you choose two playbooks basically when you're making a character? One is your general archetype of what type of criminal you are, and the other is the archetype of your bio class.
Ooh, yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and we did some back and forth and did some experimentation with different special abilities you could acquire based on your archetype. And then, so characters in the Forged in the Dark version of Synthicide have two playbooks instead of one.
Very cool. So I guess we can print one on the front and the other one on the back of the sheet?
Right.
Cool, okay. Very nice. Also, I notice a lot of material on the bioclass sheet. This is not a small paragraph or just a little bit of guidance text or one rule. There's apparently a whole slew of things that come along with being, say, completely teched out, Do you want to talk a little bit about what you think is what this helps do for the game?
This is sort of like necessity is the mother of invention. So, like, the two playbooks thing kind of solved a couple of problems. One, we just didn't have enough room on one sheet to list all the cool stuff we wanted to do. And so that kind of helped cement the decision to do two playbooks. And also, your bioclass kind of feeds into a lot of one of the ways you can avoid dying, which is like the bioclass is basically its own playbook with a bunch of special abilities, and those could be mutations or cybernetics or a mixture of the two, or like unique talents that help you mechanically and fictionally. And also, the more of those you get, the better you are at avoiding death.
Ah, so it's incentivized, in other words, greatly, because, like you say, death is final, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of like an interesting tier system where, like, okay, like if you take a lethal amount of harm, your cybernetic enhancements or talents or mutations will help you avoid that. But there's also another level where it's like, okay, like if you are just, stabilized, you may need to get some more cybernetics put in or some removed. Like there's a whole other process where you might have to spend currency or our stress analog, which is called resolve, to make sure you actually, get from on death's door to a functioning sharper again.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The connection between all that is very strong. Since you brought it up, we'll talk about when you're going through that resolve, what happens when you're out?
So when you run out of resolve, instead of traumas, we have something called cynicism, which is sort of similar fictionally in that it's kind of like a tag for you to roleplay your character and how you are becoming more nihilistic, more fatalistic as you try to live this very, very difficult life under the heel of machines and doing crimes all the time. But also, in addition to describing your character, also mechanically penalizes you, because for every cynicism you mark, you lose a point of resolve from your pool.
Yeah, it's eating away at them.
So it's kind of like a feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the more cynicism you take, the less resolve you have to spend, so the faster you get more cynicism. And you can kind of address cynicism by doing like selfless or like kind of the opposite of cynical things. Like if you were charitable or help people or like kind of go out of your way to address this gnawing angst inside yourself, you can actually remove these things over the course of the game.
Yeah, that's explicit in your game, I noticed. In Blades, for those who are listening that aren't exactly maybe familiar with everything, trauma is usually permanent. I guess their only option would be if the GM was nice, The GM says, yeah, okay, you can work on getting rid of that. But in this game, we have a way, and the way is quite positive, it seems. It doesn't play back into the negative, or the dark fiction, the dark side of that fiction. We're trying to throw some positivity in there. That to me sounds great.
Yeah, it came from my own, that's like a theme in the original Synthicide, is that when you're in a dark society, one of the ways you maintain your will to live is to try to make that society a little brighter, which is a theme that a lot of people might go through in their life, where you're really depressed and really sad and you're really anxious about your job and feel like everything sucks, and then you go volunteer on the weekend and you feel better. Or like you get so focused on like, oh, I'm so sad and so depressed all the time and these other people's lives are so hard, maybe I would feel a little better if I made their lives a little better, so there's that kind of that element where it's not true for everybody, but for a lot of people, if you take the time to look outside yourself when you're really struggling with your own suffering, it can actually alleviate your suffering. And that was like a theme in the original Synthicide, and I think Michael did a really good job bringing that forward in the system to remove cynicisms.
Yeah, cynicalness is the thing that's going to take your sharper down. So I like the idea that there's a way to get out of it that's quite clear, and that it's not all doom and gloom in this future that you've presented. I think that's important to note, and a nice way to set yourself apart from lots of the grimdark that's out there.
Yeah,
I always felt like if no one was trying to have a reason to live, then society would just 100% collapse. Like this Warhammer 40K universe where like no one does anything good for anyone ever. It's like, well, then why do they cooperate and continue to build a society? Like they may not be part of the game's prevalent narrative, but I feel like even in real life, in the worst parts of our world, people are helping each other just to try to feel that bond and feel like maybe it's not all that bad. Like even some of the worst drug lords will take amazing care of their families and amazing care of their towns, and that totally doesn't absolve them of their crimes, but that's what they do to sleep at night. I think that kind of dynamic, that give and take of like having a brutal criminal job but then trying to atone for what you've done and feel better about how you are a good force for other people. I think that's a very human thing that a lot of people go through.
Absolutely. I think this will create a nice connection between the player and their character, what they're going through. So here's something else that I've been thinking about, is these robots, do they feature themselves as playable characters in your game? Or is that totally, it's like the opposite of what you do in this game, right?
Yeah, the robots are always the other, and sometimes they're benevolent, usually they're neutral, and sometimes they're completely malicious, But yeah, they are meant to be just a force that exists outside of you and your friends and your crew. They're a class above you, and you are the crappy class. You are just generic stock humans.
Oh yeah, right, with all our imperfections.
Right.
Well, that's interesting. So it's a lot like our world today, I suppose, but there's a lot of advancement that has occurred. So it highlights a thing about the future that I think is important to mention in any science fiction work, which is that we're not going to be that different.
Yeah.
It's not like the world, like everything's going to be totally different. I mean, yeah, tech will be different, but people will still be people. I think we still have value.
Right. For sure. And then there's still that push and pull of, how much do you value other people and how much do you exploit other people, and how do the power structures, do they serve the people or do they serve the few at the top of the power structure? And this kind of takes a bleak view that the power structure serves itself and serves the tech advancement rather than the everyday person.
I kind of want to roll back to the death thing and the deadly consequences. I'm interested to know what sort of things might we see befall those who venture too far into the unknown.
Yeah, so one of the things is there's like tons of different levels of technology available to the different characters. Like some person might be using a crappy, just regular bullet pistol, just gunpowder bullet pistol. And then some security guard's going to hit him with an antimatter rifle and liquefy his insides, And Michael did some really cool work with the fictional positioning parts and the levels of effect of the Forge in the Dark engine to kind of like create this like dichotomy where, the weapons you have available and the tier of the factions you're up against very much like will put your backs against the wall, where you're like, we don't have the tech to kill these guys. How do we, so we can't go in guns blazing. How do we fix this situation? or vice versa, where like you guys, your crew tier is way leveled up and you have this really great armor, and then you're fighting people with just regular slug throwers. You're able to exert a lot more, unfortunately, cynical violence on them, because they can't really hurt you as much. And just kind of making that sort of stratification of, because violence is the only real power structure, and then like the stratification of capabilities of violence across the different tech levels is kind of like an interesting thing to play within the system. And that, again, the fictional positioning and the levels of effect system are like a really interesting way to approximate that in a really fast narrative way, rather than like a really nitpicky, detailed, like crunchy traditional gamer way. And then again, though, like if your character dies, they might be able to come back. There is like, even after final death, technically it's not even final death, but even after you actually die, you can still be taken to like an advanced surgeon to try to like stitch you back together one last time. And if you have too many cynicisms, like the role is heavily penalized, because it's like your character has lost the will to live. And then likewise, even if you are totally healthy, if you maxed out your required cynicisms, your character betrays the party and just like goes rogue, because you're like, you don't believe in anybody anymore except yourself, and then basically become an unplayable character that betrays the crew. So I thought that was something interesting Michael figured out, as like those two ends. So like at both ends of the spectrum, both lethal and emotional harm, it's your cynicism is what's gonna disrupt your ability to survive and keep going.
Sort of grim, dark retirement plan.
Yeah, you can go back to Shady Acres if you want, but you'll be a machine's like thumb slave or something.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of like the funnest part of doing this like conversion so far from the old version Synthicide, because Dustin made like a whole bunch of really cool weapons and gear and stuff. And Mark, as you know, like Blaze of the Dark games love that kind of stuff. So like, all right, well, this is obviously standard gear. This is stuff that most people would have, and this Hellfire beam rifle. Okay, well, that's probably something the fighter's going to have. That's going to be fine, because that can kill mostly everything. So yeah, it's been really fun. And also, the original Synthicide has like, it was almost a shame to lose all this like very intense like grid combat, like tactical rules that Dustin had. But I think we reclaimed like some of that, and that like our harm system is like very localized. Like you can take a certain amount of harm to different parts of your body. So instead of like just a generic condition that could affect your die pool or affect your position, it could be like, okay, you take a harm to your left arm and to your chest, and then that could feed into like what you get replaced with cyberware, or like how you're going to play your character, or like how that will affect position and affect during a firefight or a social interaction.
Oh yeah, I like that a lot. Basically, you've excised some of the mechanics from a game that already has a fan base. Dustin designed. Do you feel like there was a lot that you had to salvage to keep the life spirit of the game, or does most of that translate through the fiction?
Yeah, it's a really good fit in a lot of ways, because as I think Dustin's pointed out, like it's kind of just like Duskfall in space. Like there's just a lot of things gunning for the players instead of leviathans and corrupt government ministries. It's a church of corrupt priests and super intelligent and capable synthetics, and whatever else might be happening in the galaxy, like megafauna and whatever.
Well, yeah, but you're trapped in Duskfall usually. So here we're not trapped.
It's true, but you are kind of trapped within this social strata, right? You are trapped as being a human being in a galaxy that does not care about human beings. So you are fighting for kind of every edge you can get. So in that terms, like Blaze of the Dark wants to, as the system wants to tell a story of people who are the underdogs, basically, right? It wants to tell a story about people who are fighting for every advantage they can get. And so because Synthicide was already that kind of world, it was really easy to port that kind of stuff over. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of items that work really well on the character sheets. There's already like cybernetic enhancements and like different combat talents that translate really well into just special abilities. Just to mention earlier, like there's a whole bunch of like factions in the game that we could write up and give them tiers and NPCs and different opportunities for the players to interact with them. So yeah, I haven't had to do a whole lot of like make stuff up whole cloth. It's more been like taking what's there already and figuring out where we can put it in this system, or if we have to like make new accommodations, new rules for those parts, if they're important to the flow of the game.
So what happens when you have too many pieces of machinery in your body? Do you ever like fall to the wayside there?
Well, we were talking about that, and we had a big discussion a few weeks ago because we basically decided the system we wanted to follow is that cybernetics are essentially special abilities that you buy with coin instead of experience. And we realized that, Sharpers, the adventuring class of people in Synthicide, one of the areas that a lot of them would be spending their coin on, which, it has its own terminology within the fiction, but I'll just stick coin to kind of stay neutral. But what they spend their coin on is their long-term projects to remove their cynicisms and try to recover from their emotional trauma. And if you're spending all your coin on cyberware to get really strong and really powerful really quickly, you have less coin to spend on your own emotional health. So you might get, if you're not careful and don't balance things correctly, you'll get stuck in a loop where you're racking up cynicisms because you're not liquid enough to, feel good about yourself and deal with what your emotional issues are.
Oh, sure. And it's a downward spiral as well, like you said. Once you lose some resolve, then the cynicism just comes a-flowing, I guess.
Yeah, it's more like trying to give the players options where they want to spend their resources. Because we definitely don't want to do the thing that happens in a lot of cyberpunk stuff is having more mutations or more cybernetic prosthetics makes you less human somehow. It's more there are a lot of pressures on you, and you are going to have to decide where you want to spend your resources to try to stay alive for as long as possible.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. The interesting part, I think, about all of this is that we don't have a lot of far-flung future Blades in the Dark type hacks out there yet. I mean, there's yours, Neon Black. I mean, that's not super far-flung, though, right? That's more near future?
Yeah, that's 100 or so years in the future, 100, 200 years, cyberpunk stuff.
Yeah, what's the rough time frame for this one?
It's unknown because Earth is forgotten and the galaxy got so mature and then got so obliterated that it went into a dark age.
Oh, man. Wow, that should have been at the front of the whole episode.
Yeah.
Holy crap. I had no idea.
Edit that in later.
Yeah, that mutant war that broke society and let this cult rise to power basically obliterated almost everything, and then we entered a dark age. And then, I cribbed that theme from Isaac Asimov's Foundation, because the whole premise of that book series is that the galaxy goes through a dark age and starts forgetting things. He kind of just hand waved, the galaxy just collapsed and went into a dark age. And I was like, no, there is a definite cause for this dark age, which is a mutant force that is able to mind control anyone who becomes a mutant, and then they start obliterating all the planets, and then they literally start just blowing up every planet that they suspect might have a presence of this evil force on there. And then so it's just society just completely crumbles. And then only the outer rings where the fighting never happened, that's basically all that's left, is these fringes of the galaxy, out of this central area of the galaxy. And Earth is in the system, in the lore, we kind of nod to the players this planet is actually Earth. But everyone else knows it as Terran Altar, and no one knows what it's for. Other than that, it has a million jump gates around it. They're we don't know why this planet is important. It sucks. It's uninhabitable. It's a radioactive wasteland. But it has tons of jump gates, and it appears on every map we've ever found.
Yeah. It's clearly this is important. This is kind of exactly what would happen, I think, if people stumbled on a planet of an ancient civilization that was gone or something. I can do lightning round questions.
Be down for some lightning round.
Favorite implant?
Jump jets.
Ooh.
It's basically a rocket system in your body that lets you just take off and go chase a sky car whenever you feel like it.
Dustin stole mine. That was going to be mine.
Okay. Let's see. Favorite cynicism?
I'm a philosophy graduate, so I'm a big fan of nihilism.
Yeah. Nihilism is interesting. When you just feel like nothing has any purpose, how do you keep going?
Yeah, I can relate. Yeah, but the thing is that we'll be able to break free from that in this game, which is actually, really exciting. I do think that a lot of our listeners will be really intrigued by what you're bringing to the table. And I really think that you're looking for success with this. The art looks great. The design looks solid. And I'm really excited to see where you take this. I'm really happy I got to have both of you on the show and get both of your insights into Synthicide and all of its inspiration and touchstones. I'm glad you could make it out, and thank you for taking the time out to come out.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. We have some links that we're going to put in the show description. If you would let us know what those are, so those who are listening and don't have access to that can go ahead and find you.
Sure. My Twitter is @depenningdustin. That's DEPENNINGDUSTIN. And I pretty much only post on Twitter when I have a project up and running, or I'm tweeting at a random YouTube show, which doesn't happen that often. The place where I also make a lot of announcements about my projects is I use my mailing list on drivethrurpg.com that they made for me. So if you go to drivethrurpg and search for publishers and look up Willpower Games, WILL space POWER space GAMES, Willpower Games, that's my mark on drivethrurpg, and you can subscribe to it, and I'll be making a lot of my Kickstarter announcements to that mailing list.
Ah, excellent. And about you, Michael, where can we find you on Twitter?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at KindlingBoy. That's KINDELINGBOY, where I talk about my games and capitalism a lot.
Oh, just randomly capitalism. Yeah, right. What about Itch? We got a link for you there.
Yeah, you can find all my games at socrates.itch.io. That's SOHKRATES. And also, I just, today, the day we're recording this, finally got some stuff up on DriveThruRPG, so you can check my stuff out there at Not Writing Games.
I thought that was a joke.
No.
I thought not writing games meant you weren't writing games on drive-thru. That's hilarious. No. Okay. So your company is Not Writing Games. That's how we find you.
Yes.
Okay. Memorable. Is there anything else you'd like to plug while we got a couple minutes here?
If anyone in this audience at all dips into traditional gaming, I'm going to be revamping the core system from the original Synthicide to make a more open-ended adventure system, but that's still in the works, but that's something to keep an eye out for.
Oh, very cool. So your old fans will have something to look forward to as well. Well, they definitely will with this new product, though, if they're really, if they like what you're doing, they'll probably be into this as well. So I'm super hyped for your Kickstarter, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you drop and what you work on, through, and see how many goals that you actually just blow through the roof. That would be nice. This has been a very special episode of Hacked in the Dark, a podcast featuring Forged in the Dark games and their designers. I'm Mark, and remember, when it comes to design, we all begin our journey as hacks in the dark.